Hello there. Tonight we step behind closed doors and into the candlelit chambers of history's most fascinating secret societies, from the ancient mystery schools of Greece and Egypt to the Knights Templar and the Freemasons, to the real Illuminati of Bavaria and the shadowy orders that shaped revolutions, religions, and the modern world in ways that are still being untangled today. These are stories told not with alarm, but with curiosity. Because the truth behind most secret societies is stranger, richer, and far more human than the conspiracy theories ever managed to be. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And before we begin, the visuals you see are just for enjoyment. They are not necessary to follow along. This video is meant to be heard in the background, whether you are studying, resting, or getting ready to sleep. Now let's begin. Before there were secret societies as we understand them, with their passwords and handshakes and hierarchies of initiation, there was simply the recognition that some knowledge feels too important, too powerful, or too dangerous to share with everyone. This is a very old feeling. It may, in fact, be one of the oldest feelings that organized human communities ever developed. From the earliest evidence of religious and ritual life, cave paintings, burial practices, the arrangement of stones in patterns that only make sense if they held meaning for the people who created them. There are signs that ancient communities separated the things they showed to everyone from the things they showed only to certain people, under certain conditions at certain times of life. The boundary between the seen and the unseen world was not crossed casually. It was crossed through preparation, through testing, through a deliberate process that we now call initiation, but that every society that has ever practiced it has understood as something more fundamental, the transformation of a person from one state of being into another. In ancient Egypt, the temple priests were custodians of knowledge that was not available to ordinary Egyptians. This was not primarily a matter of arrogance or exclusion, though elements of both were certainly present. It was a matter of cosmology. The priests of the great temples understood the universe as a layered place in which the visible surface of things was underlaid by hidden structures of divine order, and the responsibility of those who understood these structures was to maintain them through ritual, through correct action, through the daily and seasonal ceremonies that kept the cosmic balance, what the Egyptians called ma'at, from tilting into chaos. This knowledge was not secret in the sense of being shameful or illegal. It was secret in the sense of being sacred, set apart, protected, transmitted only to those who had demonstrated the capacity to receive it without distorting it. The priests of Amun at Karnak, the priests of Ptah at Memphis, the priesthood of Isis, each maintained their own body of esoteric knowledge, their own rituals of initiation, their own understanding of the universe that differed in specific ways from the official state religion that the general population practiced. They were specialists in the invisible, and access to their specialty required years of preparation, study, and the gradual accumulation of trustworthiness in the eyes of those who were already inside. The Greeks, who absorbed so much from Egyptian civilization, and who sent their most brilliant minds, Pythagoras, Plato, Solon, to Egypt to study before returning home, to reshape the intellectual world of the Mediterranean, brought this tradition of esoteric knowledge back with them and made it their own in a specifically Greek form, the mystery schools. The most famous of these were the Eleusinian Mysteries, conducted annually at the town of Eleusis, about 14 miles west of Athens, in honor of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, and her daughter Persephone. The mysteries had 2 degrees: the lesser mysteries, held in spring, which prepared initiates for the greater mysteries conducted in autumn. What exactly happened during the greater mysteries, what the initiates experienced in the inner sanctuary of the Telesterion, the great hall of initiation at Eleusis, has never been fully established, because the initiates kept their oath of silence with a fidelity that has defied 2,500 years of historical inquiry. We know that the initiates drank a ritual beverage called the kykeon, a mixture of water, barley, and pennyroyal, and possibly other ingredients that scholars have debated extensively including the possibility that ergot, a fungal growth-on grain that produces compounds related to LSD, may have been among them, we know that there was a dramatic presentation, a theatrical reenactment of some kind, involving fire and darkness and revelation. We know that initiates emerged from the experience transformed in ways that they described, consistently and across centuries of testimony, as having removed their fear of death. Sophocles wrote that the initiated were thrice blessed because they alone know the true life, all others dwell in misery. Cicero, writing centuries later, said that among all the excellent and divinely beneficial things that Athens had produced, nothing was greater than those mysteries, and we know almost nothing else, the oath held. The secret was kept so thoroughly for nearly 2,000 years of continuous observance, from approximately 600 BCE until the destruction of Eleusis by the Visigoths in 396 CE, that modern scholars, despite the full resources of classical archaeology and textual analysis, have never reconstructed with certainty what the initiates actually saw and did and felt in the darkness of the Telesterion. Pythagoras, the philosopher and mathematician, ran his own version of this kind of school at Croton in southern Italy in the 6th century BCE. The Pythagorean community was structured around grades of initiation. There were the akousmatikoi, the listeners, who spent years absorbing the teachings without being permitted to question or respond, and the mathematikoi, the mathematicians in the original sense of the word, who had earned the right to engage fully with the deepest levels of the teaching. The community had its own rules, its own dietary restrictions, its own ritual practices, and its own body of mathematical and musical and cosmological knowledge that was not shared with the outside world. Pythagoras understood mathematics not as a neutral tool for calculation, but as the fundamental language of reality, the structure beneath appearances, the pattern that the visible world is woven from. To learn mathematics in his framework was not to acquire a skill, but to perceive a truth that most people were incapable of perceiving. The initiation structure of his community was the practical expression of this belief. You earned access to deeper knowledge by demonstrating that you were ready to receive it, and readiness was cultivated through years of discipline, silence, and preparation. The concept that Pythagoras built his community around, that there is a structure of reality hidden beneath ordinary appearances, accessible to those who prepare themselves sufficiently, is not merely a historical curiosity. It is the foundational idea of every esoteric tradition that followed, from the Gnostics of the early Christian era to the Hermetic philosophers of the Renaissance to the Freemasons who would claim in the 18th century to be the inheritors of the ancient wisdom tradition. Every secret society that ever existed has defined itself at some level around this same axis. There is something worth knowing that not everyone knows, and the process of coming to know it changes the person who undergoes it. This idea proved extraordinarily durable. It survived the fall of Greece, the rise and fall of Rome, the establishment of Christianity as the dominant religion of the Western world, a religion that was itself, in its earliest form, a secret society of sorts, its members meeting in private homes and underground spaces, its rituals conducted away from pagan eyes, its central mysteries, the Eucharist, the resurrection, shared only among the initiated. And it was precisely as the Christian world of the medieval period was producing its most ambitious religious projects, the Crusades, the great cathedral building programs, the intellectual flowering of the universities, that the next great chapter in the history of secret orders was written. Rome, before Christianity changed everything, had its own mystery traditions. The cult of Mithras, a mystery religion that spread rapidly through the Roman military from approximately the 1st to the 4th centuries CE, organized its initiates into a hierarchy of 7 grades, each associated with a planetary sphere, each requiring specific ritual passage before the next could be entered. The Mithraic grades ran from Corax, the Raven, at the lowest level through Nymphus, Miles, Leo, Perses, and Heliodromus, to Pater, Father, at the highest. The ceremonies of initiation apparently involved tests of courage and endurance, ritual meals, and the gradual revelation of the cult's cosmological teachings. Mithraism spread so successfully through the Roman legions that it became one of the principal competitors of early Christianity for the allegiance of the empire's soldiers and the similarities between the two traditions, the communal meal, the birth from a cave or stable, the solar symbolism, the emphasis on brotherhood, have generated discussion among historians for centuries. The Hermetic tradition, named for Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great, a legendary figure identified with both the Greek Hermes and the Egyptian Thoth, provided another channel through which the esoteric impulse flowed from the ancient world into the medieval and Renaissance periods. The Hermetic texts, a collection of philosophical and magical writings probably produced in Roman Egypt in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, presented themselves as the ancient wisdom of Egypt, preserved in secret and transmitted through a line of initiated sages. When these texts were rediscovered and translated in Renaissance Florence, Lorenzo de' Medici commissioned the scholar Marsilio Ficino to translate them in the 1460s, interrupting his work on Plato to do so because he considered the Hermetic texts more urgently important. They produced an intellectual earthquake. Ficino and his contemporaries believed they were reading texts that predated Moses, that contained the original revelation of divine wisdom from which all subsequent philosophy and religion had derived. The impact on Renaissance thought was enormous. The combination of Hermetic philosophy, Neoplatonism, and Kabbalah that Ficino and his circle developed became the intellectual substrate of what historians call Renaissance magic, a serious philosophical tradition that understood the universe as a living system permeated by hidden correspondences and sympathies, and that understood the wise person's task as learning to read and work with those correspondences. It was from this tradition that the Rosicrucian manifestos would emerge, and from which Freemasonry would draw some of its deepest symbolic resources. The chain from Eleusis to the mystery schools of Rome, to the Hermetic philosophers of Alexandria, to the Renaissance Magi, to the Rosicrucians, to the Freemasons, is not an unbroken line of institutional succession. The institutions changed, dissolved, and reformed at every step. But the impulse that moved through all of them was recognizably continuous, the conviction that the visible world rests on an invisible foundation and that learning to perceive that foundation transforms the person who achieves it. Part 2. The Knights Templar. They were founded in the aftermath of the First Crusade, in the holy city that the Crusaders had taken in 1099 at an enormous cost of human life on all sides. Jerusalem was now a Christian city, controlled by the newly established Crusader states, and pilgrims from across Europe were beginning to make the long and dangerous journey to visit the holy places. The roads between the port cities of the Levant and Jerusalem were not safe. Bandits operated them freely. Pilgrims were robbed, killed, enslaved. The new Christian kingdom lacked the infrastructure to protect the thousands of faithful making their way through an unfamiliar and often hostile landscape. In approximately 1119, a French knight named Hugues de Payan presented himself to Baldwin II, King of Jerusalem, with a proposal. He and 8 companions, all knights, all men of fighting ability and at least adequate means, wished to dedicate themselves to the protection of pilgrims on the roads to Jerusalem. They wished to live as monks under a religious rule, bound by the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but fighting men rather than cloistered ones. Warrior monks, something that had never quite existed before in this precise form. Baldwin gave them quarters in a wing of the royal palace that stood on the site of the ancient Temple of Solomon. From this location they took their name, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, shortened over time to the Knights of the Temple, shortened further to the Templars. The idea of the warrior monk caught the imagination of Europe with a speed that suggests it was addressing a deep need. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential churchmen of the 12th century, the driving force behind the Second Crusade, a man whose endorsement could make or break a religious enterprise, wrote a treatise in praise of the new order called In Praise of the New Knighthood that articulated the theological justification for the Templar concept with such persuasive force that donations began arriving from across the Christian world almost immediately. Land, money, equipment, new recruits. The Poor Fellow Soldiers went from 9 men in a borrowed palace wing to one of the wealthiest and most powerful organizations in Christendom within a generation. The organization they built was extraordinary in its sophistication. The Templars developed a system of financial transfer, effectively the first international banking network that allowed a pilgrim to deposit money in a Templar house in Paris or London and receive a letter of credit redeemable at a Templar house in Jerusalem, eliminating the risk of carrying gold across thousands of miles of dangerous road. This innovation, which seems modest enough in description, was revolutionary in its time and laid conceptual groundwork for financial instruments that are still with us today. It also made the Templars fabulously wealthy because wealth flowed through them, and some of it inevitably accumulated. Their internal structure was hierarchical and secretive. There were ranks of knights, sergeants, chaplains, and serving brothers, each with different roles and different access to the order's inner workings. The rituals of initiation were conducted privately behind closed doors, and the specific content of those rituals was known only to those who had undergone them. This secrecy, which was entirely conventional for religious orders of the period, the Cistercians and the Franciscans also maintained aspects of their internal life that were not for public view, would later be used against them with devastating effect. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars were a fixture of the Crusader world, fighting, banking, building, acquiring. Their white mantles with the Red Cross became one of the most recognizable symbols in medieval Europe. Their network of preceptories, local houses from which they managed their holdings and recruited new members, spread across England, France, the Iberian Peninsula, Germany, and Italy. At their peak, they held land and property across the entire Christian world and maintained a standing army of fighting men whose quality was unmatched. And then, on a single morning, it was over. The Friday in question was October 13th, 1307. The king in question was Philip IV of France, known to history as Philip the Fair, a description of his appearance rather than his character, because his character was that of a man who was intelligent, ruthless, and under extremely serious financial pressure. Philip had borrowed heavily from the Templars to fund his wars, and the debt was not a comfortable one. He was also in the middle of an ongoing conflict with Pope Clement V, a conflict that had complex theological and political dimensions, but that, from Philip's perspective, had a practical resolution available if he could find a way to seize Templar assets on behalf of the crown. The mechanism he chose was heresy. In the pre-dawn hours of October 13, 1307, officers of the French crown arrested every Templar they could find on French soil simultaneously. A coordinated operation of extraordinary scope and planning, carried out in secrecy and executed with a speed that prevented any significant number of Templars from fleeing or destroying documents. More than 2,000 men were arrested in a single morning. They were charged with a catalogue of offences that were both specific and extraordinary: denying Christ during the initiation ritual, spitting on the cross, engaging in obscene kisses, worshipping a severed head called Baphomet, and conducting their ceremonies in secret because the ceremonies were shameful. Under torture, many Templars confessed to some or all of these charges. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Order, confessed and then retracted his confession, and then, in a remarkable act of defiance that has echoed through 7 centuries of legend, retracted his retraction. On March 18, 1314, Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charnay were brought to an island in the Seine to be burned at the stake as relapsed heretics. Before the fire was lit, de Molay made a public statement retracting all confessions made under torture, affirming the innocence of the order and, according to the Chronicle, cursing Philip IV and Pope Clement V, predicting that both would meet him before God within the year. Clement V died 33 days later. Philip IV died before the year was out. Whether the curse was real, or whether 2 unhealthy men who were already ill simply died in the way that unhealthy men do, the timing embedded the story in the European imagination permanently. The Templars were gone, formally dissolved by Pope Clement at the Council of Vienne in 1312, their property transferred to the rival Hospitallers, their members either executed, imprisoned, or dispersed. But they were not forgotten. They became instead the most discussed, most speculated about, most mythologized organization in Western history, a status they have maintained for 7 centuries. Two mysteries attach themselves to their fall and have never been satisfactorily resolved. The first is the Templar fleet. At the time of the October 1307 arrests, the Templar naval force, based primarily at the port of La Rochelle on the Atlantic coast of France, appears to have received advance warning and put to sea before the arrests could reach them. The ships were never found. Where they went, to Scotland, to Portugal, to the Americas, in a journey 2 centuries before Columbus, has been the subject of serious historical debate and considerably less serious popular theorizing, and the answer has never been established. The second is the Templar treasury. The enormous financial holdings of the French Templars were not at the Paris Temple when Philip's men arrived. The treasury was gone. Where it went has never been determined. These two vanishings, the fleet and the money, are the spaces in the historical record into which an enormous amount of legend has flowed, and they are why the Templars, more than any other organization we discussed tonight, became the template for every subsequent secret society that wished to claim ancient, hidden, and powerful origins. In Portugal, the Templars were not dissolved but transformed. The Portuguese king Dinis I, unwilling to submit to Philip's pressure or to Pope Clement's decree, simply reconstituted the Portuguese Templars as a new organization, the Order of Christ, in 1319 with the same members, the same properties, and the same essential structure under a different name. The Order of Christ became one of the driving forces behind the Portuguese Age of Discovery. Vasco da Gama and his sailors wore the red cross of the Order of Christ on their sails when they rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India in 1498. The organization the French king had attempted to obliterate became, in Portugal, the institutional vehicle for the expansion of European civilization to every corner of the globe. In Scotland, a different tradition took root. The claim that Templar knights fleeing France in 1307 found refuge in Scotland, which at the time was under papal interdict and thus technically outside the reach of Rome's authority to enforce the suppression, and that their arrival contributed to the famous Scottish victory over the English at Bannockburn in 1314, is a piece of historical romance that professional historians find unsupported by contemporary evidence. But it is romance of extraordinary vitality. The idea that the Templars survived in Scotland and eventually transformed into the Freemasons, that the stoneworking symbolism of Scottish operative masonry was the chosen vehicle through which the Templar tradition preserved itself, has been one of the most enduring claims in the mythology of both Freemasonry and the Neo-Templar revival movements that followed. The Neo-Templar movements of the 18th and 19th centuries were themselves remarkable phenomena. The strict observance, founded by Karl Gotthelf von Hund in Germany in the 1750s, claimed a direct and continuous Templar lineage and attracted thousands of Masonic initiates across Europe on the strength of that claim. Von Hund insisted that the strict observance was governed by unknown superiors, hidden masters, never identified, who held the true secrets of the Templar tradition and communicated their instructions through intermediaries. When pressed for the identity of these unknown superiors, von Hund deferred, citing the secrecy that the tradition required. The unknown superiors were never identified because they almost certainly did not exist, but their non-existence was less immediately damaging than it might have been. The idea of a hidden authority that knows more than it reveals is, as we have seen throughout tonight's narration, one of the most powerful organizing principles available to a secret society. The Templars endure because they left the right kind of absence: a missing fleet, a missing treasury, a Grand Master who cursed his accusers from the flames and whose curse appeared, by the coincidence of timing, to have landed. An organization of extraordinary competence and power that vanished, in legal terms, overnight, leaving behind it a space in the historical record exactly the shape and size of the legends that grew to fill it. Part 3. The Freemasons. The story of how a fraternal organization of stonemasons became the most famous secret society in the world is, like most genuinely interesting historical stories, both simpler and stranger than the legends suggest. In the medieval period, the men who built Europe's great cathedrals, the masons who cut and shaped and set the stone from which those soaring structures were made, worked under a system of craft guilds that controlled access to the trade. The guilds maintained standards of workmanship, regulated wages, protected their members' interests, and managed the transmission of the trade's technical knowledge from experienced craftsmen to apprentices. This was practical, not mysterious. The knowledge of how to cut a perfect arch, how to calculate the load-bearing requirements of a flying buttress, how to lay out a floor plan of geometric precision with nothing but a rope and a few pegs. This was hard-won expertise of genuine economic value, and the guilds protected it. As part of this protection, the guilds developed systems of recognition, secret words, grips, signs by which a traveling mason could identify himself to masons in another city as a legitimate member of the craft, entitled to work and to the fellowship of the lodge. The lodge was the temporary building constructed at a major building site to house the masons and their tools, and to serve as the organizational center of the work. And it became, over time, the word for the social and organizational unit of the craft itself. By the early 17th century, something was changing in these lodges. Men who were not stonemasons, gentlemen scholars, men of learning with no practical interest in the cutting of stone, were being admitted to the lodges of Scotland and England. The first documented record of a non-operative mason being accepted into a lodge dates to 1600 in Scotland, and by the early 1700s the practice was widespread enough that it had effectively transformed the nature of the institution. The stonemasons' guilds were becoming something else, a fraternal organization that used the symbols and language of the craft, the compass and square, the plumb line, the level, the unfinished stone being worked into perfection, as a philosophical framework rather than a practical one. On June 24, 1717, St. John the Baptist's Day, a date that would become the formal founding date of the Masonic calendar, 4 London lodges met at the Goose and Gridiron Alehouse in St. Paul's Churchyard and constituted the first Grand Lodge of England. They elected a Grand Master, established a governing structure, and effectively formalized the transition from operative to speculative masonry, from a guild of working craftsmen to a fraternity of men who used the tools and symbols of the craft as moral and philosophical metaphors. The metaphors were elegant, and they proved extraordinarily appealing to the intellectual classes of the Enlightenment. The rough ashlar, the uncut stone, represented the uninitiated man, rough and unformed. The perfect ashlar, the stone cut and finished, ready to take its place in the great structure, represented the mason who had worked on himself through the teachings of the craft and brought himself to a state of moral and intellectual refinement. The building of the Temple of Solomon, the legendary project from which the Templars had taken their name 2 centuries earlier, became the central symbolic reference of Masonic ritual. The idea that the mason's work of taking raw stone and building something lasting and beautiful from it was a metaphor for the work of building oneself and then building a better world from the improved material of improved people. The 3 degrees that became the foundation of Masonic initiation, entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason, each corresponded to a stage of this development, and each was conferred through a ritual ceremony that combined elements of drama, symbol, and instruction. The ritual of the 3rd degree, which recounted the story of Hiram Abiff, the legendary master architect of Solomon's Temple, who was murdered by 3 treacherous workers who demanded his master's secrets and was killed when he refused to reveal them, became one of the most elaborated and most discussed pieces of ritual theatre in the history of fraternal organizations. It was a meditation on integrity, on the keeping of faith under mortal pressure, on the meaning of the oath, and on death and what follows it. The ritual elements of masonry and the aprons, the passwords, the grips, the symbolic tools, the movement through degrees, were held within the lodge and not disclosed to non-members. This discretion, which was less mysterious in practice than it sounds in description, was enough to generate an enormous amount of external speculation, concern, and ultimately persecution from both the Catholic Church, which banned Masonic membership for Catholics in 1738 and has maintained that prohibition with varying degrees of enforcement to the present, and from various political establishments that found the fraternal bonds of the lodges unsettling to their authority. The Masonic rolls of the 18th and 19th centuries read like a who's who of the Enlightenment and the Revolutionary era. George Washington was a Mason, as were Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, James Monroe, Andrew Jackson, James Polk, James Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, James Garfield, William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Warren Harding, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and Gerald Ford. 14 American presidents in total. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was a Mason, and his opera, The Magic Flute, is widely interpreted as a Masonic allegory, its plot a metaphor for the initiatory journey through the degrees. Voltaire was initiated as a Mason just 2 months before his death. Haydn was a Mason. Sir Walter Scott, Rudyard Kipling, Arthur Conan Doyle, Mark Twain, Oscar Wilde. The fraternity claimed an extraordinary concentration of creative and intellectual talent in the 18th and 19th centuries. This concentration was not accidental. The lodges were one of the very few spaces in the hierarchical societies of the era where a man of talent but modest birth could sit as an equal with a man of noble birth and mutual worth, defined by Masonic philosophy as the content of a man's character rather than the accident of his parentage, was what determined standing. In the England of the class system, in the France of the Ancien Régime, in the America of its revolutionary founding, this was genuinely radical. In 1826, a Morgan affair transformed American attitudes toward Masonry with sudden and lasting violence. William Morgan was a Mason in upstate New York who announced his intention to publish a book revealing the secret rituals of the fraternity. Before the book could appear, Morgan was kidnapped from his jail cell, where he had been placed on dubious charges, by a group of men who were widely believed to be Masons. He was never seen again. Whether he was murdered or spirited away to a new life in Canada or elsewhere has never been established, but the presumption of murder was immediate and widespread, and the public reaction was fierce. An anti-Masonic party was formed in the United States, the first significant third party in American political history, and ran candidates for public office on a platform of opposition to the fraternity. Masonic membership collapsed. Lodges closed across the country. The fraternity recovered over decades, and American Freemasonry today has approximately 1 million members, a fraction of its 19th century peak of millions, but a real and functioning organization. The Scottish Rite, the York Rite, the Shriners, the various appendant bodies that grew from the original 3 degrees, continue to hold meetings, conduct charitable work, and maintain the ceremonial traditions of the craft. The secrets of Masonry are, in truth, not particularly secret anymore. The rituals have been published repeatedly, most extensively by William Morgan in the very book that got him disappeared, and the Internet has made the entire ceremonial structure available to anyone with a curiosity and a search engine. What remains genuinely Masonic is not the secrecy of specific words and handshakes, but the experience of the rituals themselves, the ceremonial journey through the degrees, in the company of men who have made the same journey, who have committed themselves to the same values, who have taken the same oaths in the same language that men have been using for 300 years. That experience, by the account of those who have undergone it, is not reducible to its public description. It is something that the description points toward rather than captures. The Catholic Church's hostility to Freemasonry deserves its own moment of attention because it has been both more sustained and more principled than most popular accounts acknowledge. The papal bull in Eminenti, issued by Clement XV in 1738, was the first of what would eventually become a long series of papal condemnations that continued through the 19th century and that were given their most philosophically developed expression in Leo XIII's encyclical Humanum Genus in 1884, which argued that Freemasonry represented the earthly manifestation of the devil's kingdom, organized in opposition to the kingdom of Christ. The specific objections Leo enumerated went beyond the merely institutional. He argued that Masonic naturalism, the tendency of Masonic philosophy to ground morality in reason and human nature rather than divine revelation, was fundamentally incompatible with Catholic theology, and that the lodges stated religious indifferentism their acceptance of men of any faith on equal terms, was a practical denial of the uniqueness of Christian revelation. These are serious theological arguments, and the Church has maintained them with substantial consistency. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith issued a declaration in 1983 reaffirming that Catholics who join Masonic associations are in a state of grave sin and cannot receive Holy Communion. The question of whether a Catholic Mason is formally excommunicated or merely in a state of grave sin has been debated by canon lawyers, but the practical upshot is the same. The two institutions are in fundamental opposition and have been for nearly 3 centuries. What is striking, looking at the history of this opposition, is that the Church's concerns have not primarily been about the content of Masonic ritual. The ceremonies themselves, strange as they appear from outside, do not contain anything obviously incompatible with Christian belief. The concerns have been about structure, about the oath of secrecy, which the Church considers inadmissible because it places a human obligation above the individual's accountability to God and to legitimate authority, about the lodge's religious inclusivity, which the Church reads as relativism, and about the network of mutual obligation that the fraternity creates, which can in practice compete with an individual member's obligations to family, church, and civil authority. In a curious way, the Church's analysis of what makes Freemasonry dangerous is more precise than most popular conspiracy theories about the organization. The Church is not primarily concerned that the Masons are secretly running the world. It is concerned that the Masons are creating a parallel community of loyalty and obligation that sits alongside and potentially in competition with the communities of loyalty and obligation, the family, the parish, the civic body, that the Church considers fundamental to the properly ordered human life. Whether you find this concern compelling or not, it is a more interesting objection than the one that attributes to the organization a covert global agenda. Today, Freemasonry's approximately 6 million members worldwide continue to meet in lodges, work through the degrees, maintain the ceremonies, and support the charitable programs, hospitals, scholarships, disaster relief, that have always been a significant part of the fraternity's public face. The secrets are out, the rituals are published, the symbolism is discussed online and in books available in any library. What the fraternity retains beyond the ceremonial form is the human reality that the ceremony was always designed to create, a group of men who have made the same journey, who share a common language and a common set of commitments, who recognize in each other something that the uninitiated cannot quite see. That recognition is not nothing, that is in fact the point. Part 4, the Illuminati. The word Illuminati has been attached to so many things in the decades since conspiracy culture discovered it, that the actual historical organization, and which was real, which had a specific founding date and a specific founder and a specific agenda, has been almost entirely buried under the mythology. Let us dig it out. On May 1st, 1776, in the Bavarian city of Ingolstadt, a professor of canon law at the local university named Johann Adam Weishaupt founded a secret society that he initially called the Order of Perfectibilists. The name was soon changed to the Order of the Illuminati, the Enlightened Ones, and the date of its founding, May the 1st, would later be repurposed by various theorists as evidence of its continuing malevolent influence on events ranging from socialist revolutionary calendars to contemporary global governance. May Day, the International Day of Workers, which was set on May 1st by the Second International in 1889, has nothing to do with Adam Weishaupt or his organization. The date is a coincidence that conspiracy culture has found too useful to let go of. Weishaupt was 30 years old in 1776, a brilliant and somewhat abrasive academic whose relationship with the Jesuits who dominated Bavarian Catholic intellectual life was contentious. He had been educated by Jesuits, had absorbed their methods and their organizational discipline while rejecting their theology, and had developed a vision of what an enlightened secret organization could accomplish that borrowed extensively from what he understood of Jesuit structure. A hierarchical organization in which members at lower levels were unaware of the full agenda of the members above them, in which loyalty was built gradually through a carefully designed series of revelations, and in which the organization as a whole could pursue objectives that no individual member fully understood. The objectives Weishaupt actually had for the Illuminati were those of a committed Enlightenment rationalist. The replacement of superstition with reason, the elimination of religious influence from public life, the abolition of monarchical tyranny, and the eventual establishment of what he described as a reign of reason, a society governed by rational principles rather than by the arbitrary authority of kings and priests. These were not modest objectives. They were, in the political context of late 18th century Bavaria, genuinely dangerous objectives, the articulation of which could result in imprisonment or exile. The secrecy was therefore functional rather than mystical. Weishaupt was not hiding ancient wisdom or protecting sacred mysteries. He was hiding a political agenda that the existing power structures of Bavaria would have found threatening, and he used the apparatus of his secret society, the grades, the rituals, the oaths, the system of internal communication through aliases and coded correspondence as a practical operational security measure. The organization grew. Within a few years, it had attracted several hundred members across Bavaria and neighboring German states, and Weishaupt had made an alliance with a Freemason named Adolf Knigge, a man of considerable organizational talent that allowed the Illuminati to infiltrate existing Masonic lodges and recruit from their membership. At its peak, the Bavarian Illuminati may have had 2,000 members, including some genuinely significant figures. The poet and playwright Johann Wolfgang von Goethe is often listed among them, as is Friedrich Schiller, and various princes and aristocrats whose membership in a rationalist secret society would have surprised their conservative contemporaries considerably. The organization lasted 9 years. In 1785, the Elector of Bavaria, Karl Theodor, issued edicts banning all secret societies, and a series of raids on Illuminati members produced documents that were published by the Bavarian government as evidence of the organization's seditious intentions. The documents included internal correspondence, membership lists, and Weishaupt's own writings outlining the organization's objectives and methods. They were damning in the context of the times, and the effect of their publication was to destroy the organization entirely. Members scattered. Weishaupt fled Bavaria and spent the rest of his life in exile in Gotha, where he wrote extensively and lived into old age, dying in 1830 at the age of 82. The organization was dead, but the mythology was just beginning. In 1797, a Scottish physicist named John Robison published a book called Proofs of a Conspiracy Against All the Religions and Governments of Europe, which argued that the Illuminati had not been destroyed by the 1785 suppression, but had merely gone underground, and that the French Revolution, which had begun in 1789 and which had, by 1797, produced the terror and the execution of the king and queen and tens of thousands of others, was the product of Illuminati manipulation. A French Jesuit named Abbé Baruel published a similar argument in 4 volumes around the same time. The 2 books were enormously influential, widely read, widely believed, and the beginning of a tradition of Illuminati conspiracy theorizing that has continued unbroken to the present day. The arguments of Robison and Baruel were not without surface plausibility. The Illuminati had existed. It had infiltrated Masonic lodges. It had explicitly aimed at the transformation of European political structures. And the French Revolution had overthrown exactly the kind of monarchical and clerical authority that Weishaupt's order had opposed. The causal connection the 2 authors proposed, that the revolution was engineered by the Illuminati rather than arising from the genuine social, economic, and political conditions of France, has been examined by historians and found unsupported by evidence. But the narrative was compelling, and compelling narratives have a way of surviving the refutation of the evidence that generated them. By the 19th century, the Illuminati conspiracy theory had evolved to include Jewish bankers, Freemasons, and various other groups depending on the political anxieties of whoever was telling the story. By the 20th century, it had been absorbed into the wider world of conspiracy culture, where it became a catch-all explanation for coordinated elite activity of any kind. By the 21st century, it had migrated into popular music and internet culture, where it generates memes and album theories and red string on corkboard investigations that bear essentially no relationship to the 9-year experiment in rationalist secret organizing that Adam Weishaupt conducted in Bavaria between 1776 and 1785. The real Illuminati was a group of progressive intellectuals who wanted to change the world through the strategic use of secrecy, lasted less than a decade, and was broken up by a police raid. The mythological Illuminati is immortal, all-powerful, and responsible for everything. The distance between these two things is a measure of what the human need for explanation does when it meets a genuinely mysterious name. It is worth pausing to understand exactly how Weishaupt's organizational system worked, because it was genuinely clever, and its cleverness contributed to the paranoia that destroyed it. The Illuminati was organized into three main grades: the nursery, the Masonic, and the mysteries, each of which was subdivided into further degrees. A new recruit entered at the lowest level with no knowledge of what lay above. He was watched, evaluated, and gradually trusted with more information as he moved upward through the grades. At each level, he was given only as much of the organization's true agenda as his demonstrated loyalty and character warranted. The result was a system in which the full picture, the complete shape of what the organization was and what it was ultimately trying to accomplish, was visible only from the very top. Weishaupt used the alias Spartacus within the organization. His key lieutenant, Adolf Knigge, the Freemason whose organizational skill allowed the Illuminati to spread rapidly through German Masonic lodges in the early 1780s, went by the name Philo. The practice of aliases was not merely theatrical, it meant that documents captured by authorities would identify members only by classical pseudonyms, creating a layer of protection for actual identities. The correspondence that was seized in the 1785 raids and published by the Bavarian government, letters signed Spartacus, Philo, Ajax, Cato, read to contemporary observers exactly as sinister secret correspondence should read, full of schemes and coded references and the deliberate evasions of men who knew they were doing something the authorities would find threatening. Weishaupt's own description of his aims in his private correspondence was sometimes inflammatory in the way that private correspondence tends to be when the writer believes he is not being read by enemies. He wrote of the need to conceal the organization's true purpose from its own lower-level members until they had been sufficiently prepared to receive it. He wrote of the Jesuits' organizational methods as a model to be improved upon rather than merely imitated. He wrote about monarchy and religion with the contempt of a convinced rationalist who found both institutions to be obstacles to human progress. These letters, published without context, provided exactly the evidence that Robertson and Barrowell needed for their conspiracy narratives. Evidence that the organization was deliberately deceptive about its aims, that it was prepared to use infiltration and manipulation as organizational tools, and that its leadership held views that the majority of Europeans in 1785 would have found deeply threatening. What the letters did not provide was evidence of the global reach and permanent underground survival that the conspiracy theory required. But by the time Robertson and Barrowell were writing in the late 1790s, the French Revolution had provided a canvas large enough to accommodate any theory of secret manipulation, and the Illuminati, genuinely secret, genuinely subversive, genuinely destroyed by government suppression, was too perfect a candidate for the role of hidden cause to be left off the stage. Part 5. The Rosicrucians. In 1614, a pamphlet appeared in the German town of Kassel that caused an immediate and disproportionate sensation across educated Europe. The pamphlet was called the Fama Fraternitatis, the fame of the Brotherhood, and it announced the existence of a secret fraternity of learned men who had been working quietly for over a century to advance human knowledge and reform the world according to principles of universal wisdom. The fraternity was founded, the pamphlet explained, by a German nobleman named Christian Rosenkreuz, Christian Rose Cross, who had traveled to the Middle East and North Africa in the 15th century, studied with learned men in Fez and Damascus and other centers of learning, absorbed the esoteric traditions those men preserved, and brought that knowledge back to Europe in a synthesis that combined Hermetic philosophy, Paracelsian medicine, alchemy, and Kabbalah into a comprehensive system of understanding. According to the farmer, Rosenkreuz returned to Germany and spent years seeking learned men worthy of receiving what he had brought back. He gathered 8 companions, swore them to secrecy, gave each a specific task, and sent them out into Europe to heal the sick and advance knowledge while maintaining the Brotherhood's invisibility. They were to meet once a year at the House of the Holy Spirit, the Brotherhood's headquarters, whose location was not revealed. Each member was to designate a worthy successor before his death. The Brotherhood would remain secret for 120 years, after which its existence would be revealed and its work would enter the public world. The two documents that followed the Fama in 1615 and 1616, the Confessio Fraternitatis and the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, elaborated the vision and the mythology with increasing richness. The Confessio added specificity to the Brotherhood's theological position, affirming its Protestant Christian orientation and its hostility to the papacy and to what it characterized as the false learning of the scholastic tradition. The Chemical Wedding was the most literary of the three, an extended allegory in which Rosenkreuz is invited to the wedding of a royal couple and undergoes a series of initiatory trials, each symbolic of a stage in the alchemical transformation of the soul. These three documents taken together constitute one of the most successful pieces of literary fiction ever produced under the guise of historical revelation. The question of their authorship remains genuinely debated among scholars, though the weight of evidence points toward Johann Valentin Andrea, a young Lutheran theologian from Württemberg who would later acknowledge the Chemical Wedding as his own work, describing it as a ludibrium, a playful jest, though scholars have debated whether that dismissal was sincere or a protective denial. Andrea was part of a circle of Tübingen intellectuals who shared an ambitious vision of reforming Christian Europe through a synthesis of theology, natural philosophy, and what they considered genuine wisdom, the kind of synthesis that the Rosicrucian manifestos describe. Whether or not Andrea intended the manifestos as literal descriptions of an existing organization or as a kind of philosophical provocation, a thought experiment in the form of a claimed revelation, the response they generated was entirely literal. Within a few years of the Fama's publication, hundreds of pamphlets, books, and open letters were circulating across Germany and the Netherlands, addressed directly to the Rosicrucian Brotherhood. Aspiring members announced their worthiness. Scholars debated the Brotherhood's claims. Critics attacked them as fraudulent or diabolical. Defenders championed them as genuine. The Brotherhood, of course, did not respond. There was nobody to respond, and this silence, which should have been the end of the matter, proved instead to be its most powerful feature. A brotherhood that does not answer cannot be proven to not exist. Its silence could always be attributed to the wisdom of continued secrecy, the unseen fraternity maintaining its invisibility precisely because the time for its full emergence had not yet come. Robert Fludd, the English physician and Hermetic philosopher, was one of the most serious early defenders of the Rosicrucian cause, publishing elaborate arguments in the Brotherhood's favor that engaged both its theological and its philosophical claims. Michael Meyer, a German physician who served as personal physician to Emperor Rudolf II, the Habsburg ruler, whose Prague court was one of the great centers of alchemical and Hermetic learning in Europe, wrote extensively about Rosicrucianism and may have traveled to England specifically to make contact with people he believed to be members of the fraternity. René Descartes, upon returning from his military service in 1619, found rumors circulating that he had joined the Rosicrucians during his travels based on nothing more than the fact that he was known to be intelligent and had been abroad. He was reportedly embarrassed enough by the association to present himself publicly in Paris to demonstrate that he was corporeal and present, not invisible as the Rosicrucians were said to be. The Rosicrucian episode reveals something important about the intellectual culture of the early 17th century. Europe was in the middle of a period of profound intellectual and religious turbulence. The Reformation had shattered the unity of Western Christianity. The 30 Years' War was beginning its devastation of the German lands, and the natural philosophy that would eventually become modern science was in the earliest stages of its development. In this context, the promise of a hidden brotherhood that had already synthesized religion, philosophy, and practical knowledge into a comprehensive system that had been quietly working for a century to prepare the world for a general reformation was not merely appealing. For many educated people, it felt like exactly what the moment required. By the 18th century, genuine Rosicrucian organizations had begun to appear. Real brotherhoods with actual members, and initiatory structures, claiming the Rosicrucian lineage and organizing around its symbolism and philosophical program. The Golden Rosenkreuz, founded in Germany around 1750, was perhaps the most significant, a hierarchical fraternity with 9 grades of initiation, organized around alchemical and hermetic practice, whose membership included figures at the highest levels of the German aristocracy and intellectual world. The future King Frederick William II of Prussia was among its members, and its influence on the cultural life of the German-speaking world in the second half of the 18th century was considerable. What persists from the Rosicrucian tradition is less any specific organization than an enduring image, the brotherhood of hidden sages quietly at work in the world, known only to each other and to those they choose to approach, their labor invisible and their purpose the transformation of human consciousness rather than the accumulation of worldly power. This image has never lost its appeal. The world has always contained people who felt that its official knowledge systems were incomplete, who sensed that somewhere, kept by people wiser and more disciplined than the mainstream, there was a more comprehensive truth. The Rosicrucian manifestos gave that feeling a name, a mythology, and an organizational form that has proven remarkably durable across 4 centuries of transformation in almost everything else. Part 6. The Priory of Sion. Of all the secret societies we discussed tonight, this one requires the most careful handling because the Priory of Sion is unusual in the history of hidden orders. It was fabricated in the 20th century and retrospectively projected into the medieval past, and that fabrication was so carefully constructed and so perfectly timed that it reshaped popular understanding of Christian history, generated a global publishing phenomenon, and produced a conversation that persists to this day. The actual Priory of Sion was founded in 1956 in the small French town of Annemasse, near Geneva, by a man named Pierre Plantard. Plantard was a curious and complicated figure, a French nationalist with an intricate wartime record that has never been fully clarified, a history of minor criminal convictions including one for fraud and embezzlement in the early 1950s, a grandiose self-conception that included the belief that he was descended from the Merovingian kings of France, and a genuine talent for the patient, meticulous construction of convincing false documents. The organization he registered with French authorities in 1956 was entirely unremarkable, a small, local fraternal organization legally constituted under French law, concerned in its stated purpose with issues of affordable housing in the Annemasse area. Its official publication was called Circuit, and it ran to a handful of issues before ceasing publication. Nothing about this organization predicted what it would become. What Plantard did over the following decade and a half, working with a small group of collaborators, most importantly, a man named Philippe de Chérisey, a French actor and writer who appears to have been both genuinely creative and genuinely amused by the scale of the deception they were constructing, was build an elaborate alternative history for the organization that placed it at the center of one of the most dramatic stories ever told about Western civilization. The alternative history worked as follows. The Priory of Sion, Plantard claimed, was not founded in 1956 but in 1099 in Jerusalem, in the immediate aftermath of the First Crusade. Its founding was connected to, but separate from, the Knights Templar. The Priory was the senior organization, and the Templars had been its military arm, founded to protect the secret the Priory existed to guard. That secret was this: Jesus Christ had not died on the cross but had survived, married Mary Magdalene, and with her fathered a lineage of children who were brought to the south of France, specifically to the region known as the Languedoc, by Mary Magdalene herself, following the resurrection narrative that allowed the official story to proceed undisturbed. The bloodline of this union, the sang real, the royal blood, which later translators corrupted into San-Grial and then into Holy Grail, had continued through French aristocratic families, protected across the centuries by the Priory of Sion, whose purpose was to preserve this lineage and, at the appropriate moment, restore it to power. Pierre Plantard claimed to be a member of this bloodline. The documents Plantard and de Chérisey created to support this mythology were extraordinary in their care and complexity. Known collectively as the dossier secrets, the secret files, they included forged parchments bearing medieval-style script and authentic-looking seals, elaborate genealogical tables tracing the Merovingian bloodline through French aristocratic families to the present, and lists of the priory's successive Grand Masters through the centuries. This list of Grand Masters is the detail that has most captured the public imagination because it includes names of figures of genuine historical greatness: Sandro Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, Victor Hugo, Claude Debussy, Jean Cocteau. The implication was not merely that these men were members of a secret society, but that their greatness was in some way connected to their knowledge of the secret the priory protected. That the paintings of Leonardo, the physics of Newton, the music of Debussy were all in some sense informed by the hidden truth at the heart of Western civilization. These documents were deposited in the Bibliothèque nationale de France in Paris, available to researchers in the public reading room. The placement was deliberate and brilliant. The Bibliothèque nationale is the repository of France's genuine historical heritage, and documents found within its collections carry the implicit authority of the institution that houses them. A researcher encountering the dossier secrets in the Bibliothèque nationale would naturally extend to them the same provisional good faith extended to any other archival document. The assumption that their presence in the collection implied their authenticity. The British authors Michael Bagent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln encountered the dossier's secrets while researching a series of BBC documentary programs about a mystery in the south of France, the story of a 19th-century village priest named Béranger Saunière, who had apparently become inexplicably wealthy and who had decorated his church with imagery that the three authors found suggestive of hidden meaning. The dossier secrets provided a framework that connected Saunière's mystery to the larger narrative of the Merovingian bloodline and the Priory of Sion, and the three authors developed this framework into a book published in 1982, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. The book argued, with the full apparatus of scholarly citation and apparent rigor, that the mythology of the dossier secrets was historical fact. It sold millions of copies across dozens of languages and became one of the most commercially successful works of speculative history in the publishing industry's record. Its central claim, that the Grail legend was a coded reference to the bloodline of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and that this bloodline still existed, was examined by historians and theologians and found to be unsupported by any credible evidence. This examination had essentially no effect on the book's sales or its cultural influence. 22 years later, in 2003, Dan Brown published The Da Vinci Code, which wove the Priory of Sion mythology into a thriller plot involving murder in the Louvre and a pursuit across the monuments of European civilization. The novel sold more than 80 million copies, was translated into 44 languages, and sent millions of readers on actual pilgrimages to the locations it described. The opening pages of the novel declared that descriptions of secret societies in the text were accurate. This declaration was false, based, as it was, on Plantard's fabrication, but its authority was sufficient for the majority of readers. Pierre Plantard himself had, under oath, under questioning, by a French judge in 1993 investigating a separate matter, admitted that the Priory of Sion, as he had described it, was an invention. He had no royal blood. The dossier's secrets were forgeries. The Grand Master's list was a fiction. He had made it all up. He died in 2000. The confession did not stop the books from selling. The Priory of Sion, considered as a case study, demonstrates something that no genuine secret society has ever demonstrated with equal clarity. The power of the secret society idea is independent of the existence of an actual secret society. What people respond to and what they seek in these narratives, what they find so compelling that even a confessed fabrication cannot remove it, is not the evidence. It is the possibility. The possibility that behind the official story of Western civilization there is another story, older and more interesting, and kept by people who understood something the rest of us were not meant to know. Pierre Plantard exploited this desire. He did not create it. It was there long before him, and it remains long after him, looking for the next version of the story it needs to believe. Part 7. Skull and Bones. While European secret societies drew on centuries of Hermetic tradition and medieval mythology, American institutions were producing their own version of the hidden order, shaped less by esoteric ambition than by the particular dynamics of elite education, professional networking, and the cultivation of the loyalty that connects people across institutional boundaries for the entirety of their public lives. In 1832, a Yale student named William Huntington Russell returned from a year of study in Germany, having encountered the tradition of German student fraternities, organizations that combined intellectual seriousness with elaborate ritual and a fierce culture of lifelong loyalty among their members. With his classmate Alphonso Taft, whose son William Howard Taft would become both the 27th President and the 10th Chief Justice of the United States, the only man in American history to hold both positions, Russell co-founded what they called the Order of Skull and Bones, or alternatively the Brotherhood of Death. The founding was a response to what Russell felt was an injustice, his failure to be elected to the Phi Beta Kappa Honorary Society, which he interpreted as a political slight by a rival faction. His response was to create an organization that would, by design, be more exclusive and more powerful than the one that had rejected him. The structure Russell designed was elegant in its simplicity and far-reaching in its implications. The order would select 15 members each year from the junior class, 15 men, no more, chosen by the existing members through a process called tapping, in which a senior bonesman approaches a selected junior and literally taps him on the shoulder. The selectivity was the point. Every man who received the tap understood that he had been evaluated and found worthy by people whose own worthiness was unquestionable because they had themselves been chosen by people of equal standing in a chain that extended back to the organization's founding. The scarcity of the honor gave it weight. The physical center of the organization is a building on the Yale campus known as the Tomb, a term that sounds more dramatic than the building looks, though the building looks dramatic enough. A windowless, fortress-like structure of Connecticut brownstone constructed in 1856, its exterior bearing no signage or ornamentation beyond the numerals 322, whose significance has been debated without resolution. Some have proposed that the number refers to 322 BCE, the year of Demosthenes' death, which has a connection to a founding mythology that some accounts attribute to the order. Others have offered different explanations. The number's meaning, like much else about the organization, has been maintained as internal knowledge. What happens inside the tomb has been the subject of considerable public curiosity over nearly 2 centuries, and a small but significant amount of information has made its way out through the accounts of former members and the occasional investigative journalist willing to breach the discretion that membership is supposed to require. The weekly meeting, held on Thursday and Sunday evenings when initiated members gather, involve a combination of ritual and the practice that bonesmen call connubial bliss, which is less euphonious than it sounds. New initiates are required to lie in a coffin and deliver a comprehensive autobiographical confession to the assembled group. Their full history, their sexual history, their fears, their shames, their ambitions. Everything that a person would ordinarily keep private is made available to the Brotherhood. This practice serves 2 distinct functions simultaneously. The first is bonding. People who have shared their most private selves with a group are bound to that group by the shared knowledge of what was disclosed. The vulnerability of the confession creates a reciprocal intimacy that is difficult to replicate through ordinary social contact, and it binds the confessor to the listeners with ties that professional relationship alone cannot produce. The second function is mutual assurance. Each member possesses, by the end of initiation, sufficient knowledge of every other member to constitute a form of mutual deterrence. The secrets are held collectively. The breaking of the organization's discretion would require the breaking of one's own. The network that this system has produced across nearly 2 centuries is, by the evidence of the membership list alone, extraordinary. William Howard Taft, as noted, was a bonesman, as was his son Robert Taft, the powerful Republican senator. Henry Stimson, who served as Secretary of War under both William Howard Taft and Franklin Roosevelt, was a bonesman. McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor to both Kennedy and Johnson, was a bonesman. William F. Buckley, Jr., the founder of modern American conservatism and of the National Review, was a bonesman who wrote about his membership with a characteristic combination of disclosure and evasion. Senator John Kerry was a bonesman, and so were both George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, a fact that produced the remarkable spectacle of the 2004 presidential election, in which both major party candidates were members of the same secret society, and both declined to discuss it when asked by journalists, offering nearly identical formulations about the society's private nature. The question of whether Skull and Bones constitutes a conspiracy, whether the network of relationships it creates translates into coordinated action in public life, is one that the evidence does not support in any strong form. What the evidence does support is something more diffuse and perhaps more interesting, that the men who go through the tomb together carry a specific quality of mutual recognition and trust into their subsequent careers, that they are more likely to hire each other, to recommend each other, to extend to each other the benefit of the doubt that ordinary professional relationships do not automatically provide, and that this accumulated mutual trust, distributed across 2 centuries of American institutional life, constitutes a form of influence that is real without being conspiratorial, structural without being directed. This distinction between the conspiracy and the network, between deliberate coordination and the organic operation of shared identity, is one of the most important distinctions in understanding how secret societies actually function in the world. The conspiracy requires a plan, a meeting, a decision about what to do. The network requires only that the people within it trust each other more than they trust people outside it, and that this differential trust express itself consistently across the 10,000 small decisions that make up a career. One of the more revealing moments in the public history of Skull and Bones came during the 2004 presidential campaign, when both George W. Bush and John Kerry, the Republican incumbent and the Democratic challenger, were asked about their shared membership in the order. The moment was surreal in a way that neither candidate nor interviewer appeared fully prepared to acknowledge. The most powerful election in the world had produced 2 candidates from the same secret senior society at the same university, and both responded to questions about it with virtually identical formulations. Bush, asked by NBC's Tim Russert, said it was so secret he couldn't talk about it. Kerry, asked in a separate interview, said the same thing in slightly different words. The phrasing was almost comically identical, as though the organization had, over nearly 2 centuries of conditioning its members toward discretion, produced a single approved response to the single question its members were most likely to be asked in public. A journalist named Alexandra Robbins spent years researching Skull and Bones and published a detailed account of what she found in 2002, 2 years before that election. Her reporting, based on interviews with dozens of former members willing to speak at least partially on record, produced a picture of an organization that was neither as sinister as its critics imagined, nor as harmless as its defenders insisted. The rituals she described, the coffin confession, the ceremonies in the tomb's various rooms, the bone-themed decor, and the cryptic numerology, were odd, certainly, and the oddness was amplified by the seriousness with which grown men of significant professional accomplishment appeared to maintain them across decades of membership. But odd is not the same as conspiratorial, and the specific claim that Skull and Bones directs the careers of its members toward coordinated ends that serve the organization's agenda is not one that the evidence she gathered supports. What the evidence does support, and what the political careers of the bonesmen she examined consistently demonstrate, is that membership in the order provides something that elite institutions rarely offer explicitly, but that almost everyone within them is quietly pursuing: the certainty early in a career that a specific group of people will remember you, will think of you first when opportunities arise, will extend to you the presumption of competence and trustworthiness that saves years of proving yourself from scratch in each new environment. The bonesman who enters a new professional context carrying the invisible credential of the tap, the knowledge that he was chosen, evaluated, and found worthy, carries something that his non-bonesman colleagues cannot see and cannot match, and that shapes, in ways small and large and cumulative, the path his professional life takes. Part 8. The Carbonari and the politics of the underground. Not every secret society in history was built around mystical knowledge or elite solidarity. Some were built around something more urgent. The necessity of organizing resistance when the power being resisted had made open resistance a death sentence. The Carbonari, the charcoal burners, emerged in the Kingdom of Naples in the first decade of the 19th century, in the period of Napoleonic occupation and its aftermath, and spread with remarkable speed through the Italian peninsula and then into France, Spain, and Portugal. Their name came from the charcoal burners of the Apennine Mountains, men who worked in forest clearings, burning wood in slow, smouldering fires to produce charcoal for the ironworkers and smiths of the region. The Carbonari adopted the charcoal burners' world as their symbolic universe. Initiates were called good cousins, their meeting places were called vendite or charcoal stalls, their enemies were called pagans, and the imagery of fire transforming raw wood into useful fuel served as the metaphor for the political transformation they were working to produce. What they wanted was straightforward, if enormously dangerous to articulate in the political context of the early 19th century. Constitutional government, national independence, the end of foreign domination, and the unification of Italy's fragmented political map into something resembling a modern nation-state. After Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in 1815 and the restoration of the old monarchies at the Congress of Vienna, the Italian peninsula was divided among the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in the south, the Papal States in the centre, several smaller duchies and principalities in the north, and the powerful presence of the Austrian Empire, which controlled Lombardy and Venetia directly and exerted decisive influence over much of the rest. To speak openly in favour of constitutions and Italian unity was, in most of these states, to invite imprisonment, exile, or worse. The Bourbon Restoration in Naples re-established a court that was both reactionary and well served by police and informers. The Austrian administration in the north was efficient, methodical, and hostile to nationalism in any form. In this environment, political organizing went underground as naturally as water goes downhill. Not because the organizers preferred secrecy for its own sake, but because secrecy was the only condition under which organizing was possible. The cellular structure the Carbonari developed was both their greatest operational strength and, ultimately, their limitation. The Vendita, the local cell, maintained contact with the broader organization through intermediaries, so that the arrest of any one member revealed only the names and activities of the cell's own members, not the identities of people in other cells or the full scope of the network. This compartmentalization was good operational security. It also meant that the organization could not achieve the kind of coordinated strategic action that successful revolution requires. The uprisings of 1820 and 1821 in Naples and Piedmont, respectively, demonstrated this limitation clearly. Both were partially successful in their initial phases. Liberal constitutions were proclaimed, kings were forced into concessions, the machinery of the new order was briefly set in motion. And then Austrian military intervention arrived and the uprisings collapsed, and the reaction that followed was severe. Carbonari members were imprisoned, executed, or driven into exile across Europe, where they continued their organizing from London and Paris and Brussels, maintaining contact with each other through the networks of the Italian diaspora. Among the young men shaped by this period of Carbonari activity and its defeat was Giuseppe Mazzini, who would go on to found Young Italy, a nationalist organization that drew on the Carbonari model while attempting to overcome its limitations, and who became the intellectual father of the Italian Risorgimento, the movement that eventually produced Italian unification in 1861. Mazzini had been arrested as a Carbonari member in 1830 at the age of 25 and spent years in exile, and the experience of secret organization, of the brotherhood forged in shared risk and shared commitment to a cause larger than personal interest, shaped his thinking about how political change was made. The organizational forms that passed through Mazzini and the Risorgimento movement and into the European revolutionary tradition of the 19th century, the cell structure, the mutual oath, the graded hierarchy of initiation that revealed more of the organization's full agenda to those who had proven their commitment, are directly traceable to the Carbonari. Across the Atlantic, in the coal fields of eastern Pennsylvania, in the 1860s and 1870s, an organization that drew on the same Irish tradition of secret political organization that had shaped the Carbonari's broader European context was producing its own version of underground resistance to intolerable conditions. The Molly Maguires, named for a legendary Irish widow who led tenant resistance to landlords in pre-famine Ireland, were a network of Irish immigrant coal miners who organized resistance to the coal operators through a combination of labor agitation and, in the most extreme cases, violence against mine bosses and supervisors who were particularly notorious for their treatment of workers. The coal companies responded by hiring the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, whose agent James McParland spent 2.5 years living as a miner under an assumed identity, building a case from the inside. The resulting trials, which used McParland's testimony as their primary evidence, produced 20 hangings in 1877, executions that remain controversial to this day, with historians debating whether the convictions were just or whether the prosecutions were primarily a tool for breaking the labor organizing that the companies found threatening. What the Carbonari and the Molly Maguires share, separated by decades and an ocean, is the same essential dynamic. People whose legitimate political and economic interests are denied by the power above them taking their organizing underground, using the tools of the secret society not because those tools are inherently interesting, but because they are the tools that the conditions available require. The Fenian Brotherhood, the American arm of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, founded in New York in 1858 by Irish emigrants who had fled the famine and its aftermath, operated under the same logic. Its members took oaths of secrecy, used a cell-based organizational structure, and communicated through codes that were intended to prevent British intelligence from mapping the full extent of the network. The IRB operated simultaneously in Ireland, where it built toward the rebellion that eventually produced the Easter Rising of 1916, and in the United States, where it raised funds, trained volunteers, and attempted a series of raids into Canada in the 1860s that were militarily farcical but politically significant, demonstrating to the British government that the Irish question could generate diplomatic complications at the very borders of its closest neighbour. What is striking, looking across the history of political secret societies, is how consistently the cellular structure reappears. The small, locally organized unit with limited knowledge of the wider network, connected to the broader movement through carefully managed intermediaries. This structure appears in the Carbonari, in the Fenians, in the early Bolshevik Party, in the French resistance during the Second World War, and in resistance movements against occupation and authoritarian government on every inhabited continent. It reappears because it is the correct solution to a specific problem. How to maintain organizational continuity when the agents of the state you are opposing are actively trying to find and destroy you. The secret society in these contexts is not a preference, it is a necessity, and the organizations that used it most effectively, that maintained the deepest compartmentalization, that protected their members most carefully, that built networks that could survive the arrest of individual nodes without collapsing, were the ones that survived long enough to accomplish what they set out to do. This is perhaps the most important corrective that the history of political secret societies offers to the popular imagination of the secret organization. The image of the hidden order as a conspiracy of the powerful is only half the picture. The other half is the hidden order as the refuge of the powerless, the form that political organization takes when every other form has been made impossible by the power arrayed against it. Secrecy is not inherently the tool of those who seek to dominate. It is also, and perhaps more fundamentally, the tool of those who seek to survive. Part 9. The Thule Society. Munich in the autumn of 1918 was a city coming apart. The war that Germany had fought for 4 years was ending, not in the triumphant peace the propaganda had promised, but in collapse. The army retreating, the Kaiser abdicating, a revolutionary council of workers and soldiers briefly seizing control of the Bavarian government in November of that year. The streets that had seen the cheerful mobilizations of 1914 were now full of returning soldiers who had been through experiences the civilian world had no framework to understand. Unemployed workers, desperate families, and the political representatives of every ideology from anarchism to monarchism competing for the attention of a population that was frightened, humiliated, and hungry for an explanation. Into this environment came Rudolf Freiherr von Sebottendorf, a German adventurer of mysterious background, self-styled nobleman, student of astrology, numerology, and Sufi mysticism, and since early 1918 the head of the Bavarian branch of the Germanenorden, a Völkisch secret society that combined German nationalist ideology with an explicitly racial theory of history. In August of 1918, Sebottendorf reorganized the Munich branch of the Germanenorden under a new public name, the Thule Society, after the mythical northern homeland of the Aryan race, and began holding meetings at the Hotel Vier Jahreszeiten, one of Munich's most prestigious establishments, under the cover of a study group devoted to ancient Germanic culture. The Thule Society was never large. At its peak it may have had 250 members in Munich and perhaps 1,500 across Bavaria. But its membership was socially and professionally significant. Lawyers, physicians, academics, minor aristocrats, newspaper publishers. The society owned a newspaper, the Münchener Beobachter, which Sebottendorf had acquired in 1918 and which would shortly be renamed the Völkischer Beobachter, the People's Observer, under its new ownership by the National Socialist German Workers' Party. That transfer of the newspaper is one of the concrete connections between the Thule Society and the early Nazi Party, and it is representative of the way that connection actually worked, not through mystical transmission of occult power, but through the ordinary mechanisms of money, social networks, and organizational support. Several figures connected to the Thule Society were among the early members and organizers of the German Workers' Party, which became the NSDAP. Dietrich Eckart, the playwright and journalist who became one of Hitler's earliest mentors, was a Thule member. Karl Harrer, one of the co-founders of the German Workers' Party, was a Thule member. Rudolf Hess, who became Hitler's deputy, moved in circles connected to the Thule Society and to the broader Munich occult world of the period. What the Thule Society contributed to the ideological atmosphere in which Nazism developed was not a secret plan, but a set of ideas and images: the mythology of the Aryan race, the symbolism of the swastika, the language of blood and soil and German spiritual destiny, that the Nazi movement absorbed and amplified and weaponized in ways that Sebottendorf himself, whatever his considerable faults, probably did not intend and could not fully have anticipated. Ideas, once released into a cultural environment in crisis, go where the crisis takes them. Hitler himself was never a Thule Society member. His relationship with occultism was contemptuous rather than credulous. He regarded the Völkisch enthusiasm for runes and racial mythology as a distraction from the brutal political clarity he considered his primary instrument. When Sebottendorf published a memoir in 1933 titled Bevor Hitler kam, Before Hitler Came, claiming credit for the Thule Society's role in the Nazi movement, the book was promptly suppressed by the regime and Sebottendorf was expelled from Germany. The Nazi Party, having absorbed what it needed from the Völkisch occult tradition, had no interest in sharing its origin story with an organization it considered a historical footnote. The figure within the Nazi leadership who most genuinely engaged with the esoteric tradition was Heinrich Himmler, and his engagement is worth understanding because it illustrates the specific danger that arises when the organizational forms of the secret society are combined with state power and genocidal ideology. Himmler was fascinated by Germanic history, Norse mythology, and the idea of the SS as a new chivalric order whose members were the spiritual as well as racial elite of the new Germany. He restructured the SS deliberately along the lines of a religious order. The Allgemeine SS had its own internal hierarchy of ranks with their own insignia and protocols, its own code of conduct and honor that was explicitly framed in quasi-monastic terms, and its own central ceremonial site, Wewelsburg Castle in Westphalia, which Himmler had leased from the local district and was renovating at enormous expense into what he envisioned as the spiritual center and eventual Camelot of the SS order. The North Tower of Wewelsburg, which Himmler earmarked for ceremonial use by the SS leadership, featured a circular room known as the Obergruppenführersaal, the General's Hall with a large swastika-like design inlaid in the marble floor known as the Schwarze Sonne, the Black Sun, a symbol of some significance in post-war neo-pagan and esoteric circles that claim a lineage from Himmler's SS symbolism. Below it was a circular crypt intended as a place of SS ritual. The full elaboration of Wewelsburg as the spiritual headquarters of the order was never completed. The war's demands on labor and resources prevented it, but the intention is clear from the architectural plans and from Himmler's own writings about what the castle was meant to become. This episode, Himmler's attempt to construct a genuine secret order with its own mythology, its own rituals, its own sacred geography, demonstrates something important that the Thule Society's story only implies. The organizational forms of the esoteric secret society are not in themselves good or evil. They are powerful tools for creating solidarity, loyalty, and shared identity that can be placed in the service of almost any objective. When those objectives are the relief of human suffering or the advancement of knowledge or the cultivation of personal virtue, the forms serve those ends. When those objectives include the systematic murder of millions of people, the same form, the hierarchy, the ritual, the exclusivity, the culture of loyalty above ordinary law, serve those ends instead, and with terrible efficiency. Sebottendorf spent the Second World War in Turkey, where he had lived for extended periods earlier in his life. He died on May 9, 1945, the day after Germany's unconditional surrender, in Istanbul. Whether he died by suicide or by drowning in the Bosphorus, and whether either was intended, has never been established. He entered the historical record as he had lived in it, surrounded by unverifiable claims and the faint smell of self-construction. Part 10. Opus Dei. On October 2, 1928, in a Salesian retreat house in Madrid, a 26-year-old Spanish Catholic priest named José María Escrivá de Balaguer experienced what he would describe for the rest of his life as a divine illumination, a vision, sudden and complete, of a new kind of Catholic calling. He was in the middle of reading through his notes from previous months when the vision came, and he was so overcome that he left the room, went to the retreat house chapel, and wept. What he had seen, he believed, was not his own idea but God's direct communication to him of an organizational form that the Church had never previously possessed, a way for ordinary lay people, not priests, not members of religious orders, but workers and professionals and students living fully in the secular world, to pursue sanctity through the sanctification of that ordinary life. He called the organization Opus Dei, the work of God, and he spent the next 47 years building it into a global institution of extraordinary reach and discipline before his death in 1975. The organization now operates in more than 90 countries with approximately 90,000 members, and it has attracted sustained controversy that, depending on your position, either reflects a misunderstanding of what it is or a too clear understanding of what it is. The membership structure Escrivá designed is more graduated than most outsiders realize, and understanding it is necessary for understanding both the organization's appeal and its controversies. At the base are the supernumeraries, married laypeople who participate in Opus Dei's spiritual formation programs, which include regular spiritual direction, group reflection sessions, and retreats, while living fully independent professional and family lives. Supernumeraries are the largest group by far, constituting the majority of the organization's membership, and their involvement is relatively light. A commitment to a specific pattern of prayer and regular contact with an Opus Dei spiritual director, but no common residence, no economic dependency on the organization, no restriction on outside relationships. Above them in the internal hierarchy are the associates, celibate members who do not live in Opus Dei centers but are more fully committed to the organization's apostolic work. And at the top are the numeraries, celibate members who live in Opus Dei residences, surrender their full professional income to the organization, and constitute the operational core that runs the centers, the schools, the universities, and the other apostolic works through which Opus Dei pursues its mission. It is the numerary life that has generated the most intense controversy. Numerary women, in particular, practice a regime of mortification that draws on traditional Catholic asceticism, but that has struck many observers as extreme by contemporary standards. The cilice, a spiked metal chain worn around the thigh for 2 hours each day, and the discipline, a small rope whip used to strike the back or legs once a week, are among the mortification practices that Escrivá mandated and that the Catechism of Opus Dei still describes as means of spiritual growth. Former numeraries have described these practices in terms that range from meaningful to traumatic, and the range of testimony suggests genuine variation in how the practices are experienced depending on the individual, the community, and the quality of the spiritual direction provided. The secrecy question, whether Opus Dei encourages members to conceal their affiliation, has been one of the most persistent sources of controversy. The organization's official position has evolved over the decades. Escrivá's original instructions, which appear in the organization's internal documents, did counsel members not to reveal their affiliation without specific reason, a practice he described as discretion appropriate to the spiritual life. Critics argue that this discretion has the practical effect of allowing Opus Dei members to develop influence within organizations, governments, universities, media, without those organizations being fully aware of the network operating within them. The organization now publicly acknowledges its existence and maintains an active press office, but former members have described an internal culture in which the identities of fellow members were still protected from outside disclosure. The political dimension of Opus Dei's history is real and significant. In Spain, under Francisco Franco, members of Opus Dei occupied senior positions in the government's economic ministries from the late 1950s onward. The technocrats, as they were called, who modernized Spain's economy along liberal capitalist lines while the political structure remained authoritarian. This combination of economic modernization and political conservatism was entirely consistent with Opus Dei's theology, which sought to engage fully with the modern professional world while maintaining an uncompromising commitment to Catholic orthodoxy, but it gave the organization an indelible association with a specific political model that has colored perceptions of it ever since. Pope John Paul II canonized José María Escrivá in 2002, 27 years after his death, a process that moved faster than almost any other canonization in church history, and that some church historians found procedurally questionable, noting that the normal requirement of a substantial waiting period after death and a rigorous examination of the candidate's writings and life appeared to have been accelerated. John Paul II had a close personal relationship with Opus Dei and had given the organization its unique canonical status as a personal prelature in 1982, a status that places it under the direct jurisdiction of the Pope rather than any diocesan bishop, giving it an unusual degree of independence within the Church's organizational structure. What Opus Dei is, stripped of the hagiography of its supporters and the alarm of its critics, is a highly disciplined, highly effective Catholic organization with a specific theological vision, a sophisticated hierarchical structure, and global reach maintained through a combination of genuine spiritual formation, institutional investment, and a culture of loyalty and discretion that the organization considers appropriate and that its critics consider excessive. The questions it raises about the relationship between religious formation and personal freedom, about the transparency of organizations operating within public institutions, about the boundary between spiritual discipline and psychological control, are serious questions that deserve engagement rather than dismissal in either direction. Part 11. The Order of the Solar Temple. Most secret societies end in the same way, gradually. The enthusiasm fades, the membership ages without being renewed, the rituals that once felt charged with meaning begin to feel merely habitual. The organization dissolves into a club, and the club dissolves into an occasional dinner, and the dinner dissolves into nothing. This is the ordinary trajectory of the hidden order, a slow cooling that ends in mere absence, the organization surviving only in its own archives. The Order of the Solar Temple did not end this way. Luc Chouret was a Belgian homeopathic physician whose professional life was organized around the giving of lectures, seminars on health and alternative medicine that drew audiences across Belgium, France, Switzerland, and Quebec, audiences drawn as much by the force of his personality as by the specific content of what he said. He was charismatic in the specific way that attracts followers rather than merely admirers. He conveyed absolute certainty, communicated a sense of special knowledge accessible only to those willing to undergo the necessary preparation, and created in his listeners the feeling that they had encountered something their ordinary lives had not provided. He had been involved with various esoteric organizations before founding the Solar Temple, including a Martinist order, and he brought from those involvements a familiarity with the organizational forms of the initiatory fraternity, the degrees of initiation, the hierarchies of knowledge, the culture of the inner circle. Joseph Di Mambro brought different skills to the partnership: organizational ability, financial management, and a decades-long history in the world of esoteric organizations that gave him the social capital to recruit from established networks of people with existing interests in alternative spirituality. He had been involved with the Rosicrucian organization AMORC for years before its leadership expelled him for reasons that were never made fully public. The expulsion apparently left him with both a comprehensive knowledge of initiatory organizational structure and a grievance that added a specific edge to the empire he subsequently built. The theology that Jouret and Di Mambro developed for the Solar Temple drew on an eclectic but internally coherent synthesis of sources. At the center was the mythology of the Knights Templar. The OTS claimed a direct initiatory lineage from the medieval order with its own rituals, presenting the initiate as receiving a transmission of esoteric knowledge that the Templars had preserved since the Crusades and that had been passed through a series of hidden masters to the present leadership of the Solar Temple. Rosicrucian symbolism and the language of alchemical transformation were layered over this Templar foundation. New Age beliefs about the Earth's imminent spiritual transformation, the transition from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius, provided the cosmological urgency that explained why this particular moment in history was one in which the organization's mission was critical. The physical ceremonies Jouret and Di Mambro conducted for their members were impressive and apparently transformative. Participants described ceremonies in which luminous figures appeared in the ritual space, apparent manifestations of the masters whose guidance the organization claimed to receive, and in which other apparent paranormal phenomena occurred: voices from nowhere, light effects that seemed to have no physical source, objects that moved without visible agency. The atmosphere these ceremonies created, the combination of elaborate Templar regalia, genuine medieval-inflected ritual language, and what appeared to be genuine paranormal occurrence, produced in many members a conviction that they had found something real that the mainstream world had lost. Di Mambro had built the paranormal manifestations from theatrical components, concealed projectors, strategically placed speakers, lighting rigs hidden behind decorative panels. He was, in effect, running a sophisticated stage magic operation in the service of a spiritual agenda. When a long-time member, Tony Dutoit, a Canadian who had served as the organization's technical director, discovered the apparatus behind the effects and began to speak about what he had found, Di Mambro's response revealed the nature of the organization's inner logic with terrible clarity. Dutoit and his wife Nikki were declared traitors. Their infant son, Emmanuel, was declared by Di Mambro to be the Antichrist, an enemy of the cosmic mission the organization was pursuing. In early October of 1994, the Dutoit family was killed at their home in Quebec. Tony stabbed, Nikki stabbed, and 3-month-old Emmanuel stabbed multiple times with a wooden stake. Days later, the series of deaths that would define the Solar Temple's legacy began. On the night of October 4-5, 1994, fires were set simultaneously at Solar Temple properties in 2 Swiss villages. In the underground chapel of a farmhouse in Sherry, 23 bodies were found arranged in a circle with their feet pointing toward the center, their heads wrapped in plastic bags, many of them shot in the head. At 3 adjacent chalets in Granges-sur-Salvan, 25 more bodies were found. Among the dead in Switzerland were Luc Jouret and Joseph Di Mambro. In December 1995, 16 more bodies were found in a forest in the Vercors Plateau in France. Another group of Solar Temple members who had gathered for what the organization described as a transit, a passage to a higher existence on another world. 3 of the 16 were children. In March 1997, 5 more deaths occurred in Saint-Casimir, Quebec. A family that had been unable to join the previous transits and who had arranged their own passage, including 3 teenage children who were apparently full participants in the decision. 74 people died in connection with the Order of the Solar Temple. Their ages ranged from 3 months to 70 years. They included a former mayor of Richelieu, Quebec, a civil servant in the Quebec Environment Ministry, a journalist, doctors and lawyers and teachers and people of many ordinary professions. They had been drawn by genuine spiritual hunger into an organization whose outer architecture of symbol and ceremony and ancient lineage concealed at its center the grandiose and paranoid psychology of men who believed themselves to be cosmic agents, and who, when that belief was threatened, chose death over doubt. Part 12. Living Secrets. Having moved through more than 2 millennia of hidden orders, from the Telesterion at Eleusis to the Swiss mountain chalets of the Solar Temple, it remains to ask what the present looks like. What organizations exist today that carry the tradition of the secret society forward, and what their existence tells us about the needs that tradition has always served. The Bilderberg Group is perhaps the most famous of what might be called open secrets. Organizations whose existence is publicly acknowledged, but whose workings are genuinely private. Founded in May 1954 at the Hotel de Bilderberg in the Dutch town of Oosterbeek, its first meeting organized by the Polish émigré and political advisor Josef Rettinger at the instigation of Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, the group holds an annual conference of approximately 130 to 150 senior figures from European and North American politics, business, finance, media, and academia. The invitation list is assembled by a steering committee according to criteria that remain internal, but the general profile of invitees is consistent: people who are either currently exercising significant institutional power or appear likely to do so in the near future. The conferences are private in a specific and deliberate way. There is no official agenda published in advance. There are no press credentials issued. Journalists have been excluded from coverage since the founding, though the existence of the conferences and the lists of attendees have been publicly available since the 1970s. No transcript is kept. No communique is issued afterward. The discussions that take place within the conference rooms are governed by a modified Chatham House rule. Attendees may use information from the discussions but may not attribute it to specific speakers, which in practice tends to produce the full discretion of non-attribution as the safer default. What happens at Bilderberg, according to both the organization's own description and the accounts of people who have attended over the years, is discussion. Senior people from different countries and different sectors, politicians who can speak frankly about policy without the constraints of their official positions, executives who can share information without the constraints of market-sensitive disclosure rules, academics who can speculate without institutional consequence, talk to each other without the audience of press or public that normally constrains what people in these positions can say. The value of the conference in this account is precisely the privacy that enables frankness. Critics argue that this description, while accurate as far as it goes, omits the most significant feature of the arrangement, that the informal conversations and relationships developed at Bilderberg produce coordination effects that cannot be attributed to any specific agreement, but that nonetheless represent a form of alignment between powerful interests that operates outside any democratic accountability structure. When a finance minister and the head of a major bank spend 3 days at the same mountain resort discussing economic policy without any public record of what was said, the decisions each subsequently makes in their official capacities may be influenced by that conversation in ways that the public has no way to evaluate or challenge. Every summer in the redwood forests of Sonoma County, California, the Bohemian Grove hosts what its members call the Midsummer Encampment, a 2-week gathering of approximately 2,000 men, drawn from the membership of the Bohemian Club of San Francisco and their guests, that combines the atmosphere of a summer camp with the social density of a professional conference. The membership of the Bohemian Club has historically skewed toward the upper registers of American professional life: senior executives, former presidents, prominent academics and scientists, musicians and artists of the first rank. The encampment opens with the cremation of care ceremony, a theatrical ritual conducted at dusk at the base of a 40-foot concrete owl on the shore of a lake within the camp. A barge carries an effigy, the symbol of worldly care and professional responsibility, across the water, accompanied by figures in ritual robes. The effigy is placed at the base of the owl and burned, the symbolic release of mundane concerns, so that the assembled men can spend their 2 weeks in the grove free of the weight of the positions they occupy in the outside world. The ceremony was filmed clandestinely by the journalist and radio host Alex Jones in 2000, and the resulting footage of prominent men in robes performing what appeared to be a ritual before a large stone owl generated predictable alarm among audiences unfamiliar with the tradition of theatrical fraternal ceremony. The cremation of care is not a religious ritual in any meaningful sense. It is a piece of amateur theatre, self-consciously artificial, that has persisted across more than a century because the men who participate in it find something genuine in the symbolic permission it extends, the permission to, briefly, not be what they are in the world outside the grove. Whether this permission enables better thinking and more honest conversation among people who hold real power, or whether it simply provides wealthy and powerful men with an expensive summer holiday dressed in the clothing of significance, is a question that reasonable people evaluate differently. What lies beneath both the Bilderberg conferences and the Bohemian Grove encampment, and beneath the dozens of less visible private networks, dining clubs and informal organizations that connect the powerful to each other in every significant capital city in the world, is the same fundamental social mechanism that has driven the formation of secret societies since the mystery schools of antiquity: the deliberate restriction of access as a tool for creating and maintaining solidarity among those who are inside. This mechanism does not require conspiracy to be effective. It does not require a plan, a decision, a coordinated agenda. It requires only that the people within the network trust each other more than they trust people outside it, that the shared experience of the lodge room or the conference center or the forest camp creates a differential that expresses itself across thousands of individual decisions over the course of professional lifetimes. The shared experience is the mechanism. Everything else, the ritual, the ceremony, the oath, the secret word, is the machinery for creating the experience. And this is why the secret society is not a feature of any particular historical period or any particular culture. It is a recurrent solution to a recurrent problem, the problem of how to build trust at the level of depth that significant shared enterprise requires in a world where ordinary social contact produces acquaintance, but not the specific intimacy of people who have undergone something together that others have not. The Eleusinian initiates who emerged transformed from the darkness of the Telesterion were solving the same problem that the bonesmen in the tomb are solving today: how to make something that binds, that holds, that creates a we, that persists beyond the ceremony that constituted it. 2,500 years separate the Telesterion from the tomb. The building materials are different, the theology is different, the specific content of what is shared is different, the human need being served is exactly the same. There is one more organization worth naming before we turn toward our final reflection. Not because it is the most powerful or the most secretive, but because it demonstrates most clearly the way that the tradition of the hidden order has adapted to the information age without abandoning its essential character. The Le Cercle Group, named for the round table at which its founding members sat, has been meeting since the early 1950s. Its membership has included senior European politicians, intelligence officials, newspaper proprietors, and central bankers from across the Atlantic world. Unlike the Bilderberg Group, it maintains no public profile whatsoever. It does not publish attendance lists, does not acknowledge its meetings in any official communication, and has been reconstructed primarily through the patient archival work of individual researchers who cross-referenced biographies, memoirs, and declassified intelligence documents to establish who attended which gatherings where. The picture that emerged from this research is of an organization that sits, in the view of the researchers who have studied it most closely, at the intersection of European conservative politics, intelligence services, and financial power. an informal network that has apparently discussed and potentially influenced significant political decisions in Western Europe over more than 70 years, without leaving any public record of having done so. Whether Le Cercle is a conspiracy or a network, whether its influence has been coordinated and deliberate, or merely the natural expression of a group of like-minded powerful people who find each other's company stimulating, is precisely the question that the organization's opacity makes impossible to answer. And this impossibility is itself revealing. In the age of the internet, when the location of every Bilderberg conference is known weeks in advance, when the Bohemian Grove encampment is filmed from the surrounding hills, when the membership of every registered organization in every democratic country is theoretically available under freedom of information legislation. In this age of apparently total transparency, there are still organizations that maintain a genuine secrecy, not through elaborate ritual oaths, but through the simpler and more durable technology of social trust among people who understand, without being told, that some conversations are for the room and not for the record. The hidden order, it turns out, does not require candlelight and ceremonial aprons to function. It requires only people who trust each other enough to speak freely and who value that freedom enough to protect the conditions that make it possible. Everything else, the grades of initiation, the passwords, the ritual, the mythology of ancient lineage, is the elaboration that human beings add when the functional need for secrecy meets the human love of meaning and ceremony and the beautiful architecture of the hidden thing. Tonight, we have walked through more than 2 millennia of hidden orders, secret chambers, and the remarkable human capacity for organized mystery. We began in the ancient world, where the impulse to separate sacred knowledge from ordinary knowledge expressed itself in the mystery schools of Greece and the temple priesthoods of Egypt, institutions that understood secrecy not as deception, but as the appropriate container for truths that required preparation to receive. We moved through the medieval world, where the Knights Templar built an organization of extraordinary power and sophistication and were destroyed in a single morning by a king who owed them money, their fleet and their treasury vanishing into the historical record as cleanly as their Grand Master's curse materialized into the deaths of his accusers. We sat with the Freemasons in their lodges, understanding how a guild of working stonemasons became the preferred fraternal organization of the Enlightenment, how the metaphors of the craft of taking rough stone and shaping it into something worthy of a great building became a philosophical program for the cultivation of the self. We untangled the real Illuminati from its mythological double, finding in Adam Weishaupt's Bavarian rationalist conspiracy a genuine and interesting historical organization whose 9 years of existence generated centuries of explanatory mythology. We traced the Rosicrucians from a pamphlet of uncertain authorship in 1614 through the European intellectual world it ignited and into the present organizations that claim its name. We unmasked the Priory of Sion as a 20th century fabrication so artfully constructed that the world chose to believe it even after its inventor confessed. We sat in the tomb at Yale with the bonesmen and understood that elite solidarity, maintained through shared ritual and mutual disclosure, is a form of power that operates below the threshold of any individual conspiracy. We followed the Carbonari through the mountain forests of Italy and recognized that secrecy, for those who lack the protection of institutional power, is not a choice but a survival mechanism. We stood at the edges of the darkness. The Thule Society's contribution to the ideological soil of Nazism, the solar temples, 74 dead in Swiss chalets and French forests, the cautionary tales of what happens when secret organizational structures are captured by grandiosity and paranoia and removed from any accountability to the world outside the door. What connects every one of these organizations, from the initiates of Eleusis to the members of Le Cercle, from the knights who built their network across the medieval world to the students who confess their secrets in a brownstone building on the Yale campus, is not a continuous institutional tradition. The institutions broke and reformed and transformed beyond recognition at every step of the journey. What connects them is something less tangible and more fundamental, a persistent human conviction that the visible world is underlaid by a deeper structure, that this deeper structure is accessible to those who prepare themselves to receive it, and that the preparation, the initiation, the degree, the ordeal, does something to the person who undergoes it that cannot be done by any other means. Whether that something is the mystical illumination that the Eleusinian initiates described, or the moral refinement that Freemasonry's philosophy aims at, or the professional solidarity that Skull and Bones cultivates, or simply the intense social bonding that any shared ordeal produces, these different versions of the same experience are all, in the end, variations on a single theme: the transformation of the individual through deliberate encounter with something larger than themselves in the company of others who are undergoing the same transformation. This theme is not specific to secret societies. It appears in the rites of passage that every human culture has ever developed, in the religious practices of every tradition, in the sports team and the military unit, and the theatre company and the surgical ward. Human beings seek transformation. They seek belonging. They seek the experience of having been through something together that changes the nature of the relationship with the people who went through it alongside them. The secret society is simply one of the more elaborated and more durable forms that this seeking has taken, one that adds to the shared experience the particular charge of secrecy, the extra weight of what is held in common precisely because it is not shared with anyone else. The candlelight dims. The lodge room quiets. The initiates return to the world outside, carrying what they carry, knowing what they know, related to each other now in a way they were not related before the evening began. The door closes behind them, and in the space between what happened inside and what they will tell anyone who asks, in that gap which has been maintained with such remarkable consistency across so many centuries and so many different kinds of organizations, the secret society continues to be what it has always been, not a conspiracy, not a repository of ancient power, but a human place made of human needs, doing what human institutions do when they work as they are meant to work. They hold people together, they hold things worth holding, and they pass what is worth passing to those who are ready to receive it. We visited the Priory of Sion and found at its center not a medieval brotherhood, but a 20th century forger with an extraordinary talent for making myths that the world wanted to believe. We walked through the tomb with the bonesman of Skull and Bones and understood how a senior society at an American university became, over nearly 2 centuries, one of the most durable elite networks in the history of American institutional life. We followed the Carbonari through the cellars and forest camps of 19th century Italy and recognized in their cellular structure the organizational template that resistance movements would use wherever power made open resistance impossible. We stood at the edges of the darker chapters, the Thule Society and the Völkisch occultism that provided one strand of the ideological fabric of Nazism, Opus Dei, and the questions about transparency and freedom that a highly disciplined religious organization raises when it operates in the spaces between ordinary institutional oversight, and the Order of the Solar Temple and the 74 deaths that stand as a warning about what secret organizational structures can become when they are captured by delusion and ego unchecked by any accountability to the outside world. And we arrived at the present, where the tradition continues in different forms: the private conference center, the private campground, the informal network of dinner tables and club memberships through which the powerful maintain the relationships that power requires, and that democracy's transparency demands they maintain more openly than they typically do. What connects all of these organizations across all of these centuries and all of these contexts is not a global conspiracy. It is not an unbroken chain of secret transmission from ancient Egypt to the present day. It is something more modest and more profound, the consistent human desire to be part of something larger than oneself, to share knowledge or experience or commitment with a specific group of people in a way that is bounded and protected and meaningful, precisely because it is not available to everyone. The secret society is, at its heart, a particular answer to a universal question. The question is, how do I belong? How do I find the people who see what I see, know what I know, value what I value? How do I create a space in which I can be fully what I am in the company of others who understand fully what that is? The answer that the secret society offers is come inside, undergo the initiation, take the oath, learn what we know, and in the knowing of it together become something that none of us could be alone. That answer has been given in the stone chambers beneath the Telesterion at Eleusis, in the candle-lit lodge rooms of the 18th century Freemasons, in the underground meeting places of the Carbonari, and in the tomb at Yale. It has been given by genuine mystics and by charlatans, by people who were protecting truths and by people who were selling fictions, by organizations that genuinely sought the improvement of their members, and by organizations that sought, through their members, the improvement of the organization's power. The human need that the answer addresses has not changed in 2,500 years. And so the orders continue. The lodges meet on their appointed evenings. The oaths are taken in the language that the oaths have always been taken in. The candles are lit, the doors are closed, and somewhere in the space between what the initiates know and what the rest of the world wonders about, something that is both very old and very present continues quietly in the way that the things that matter most always continue, not with noise or spectacle, but with the patient, persistent energy of people who believe that some things are worth keeping and protecting and passing on. Let the candlelight dim now. Let the lodge room settle into its particular quiet. Let the passwords and the handshakes and the rituals sleep until the next meeting, when they will be taken up again by the hands and voices of people who chose to carry them forward. Whatever secrets are kept tonight in whatever chambers we will never see, let them rest. And let you rest with them in the comfortable mystery of a world that is older and more organized and more human than it first appears, where the doors are closed not always because something sinister is behind them, but often because some things are simply for the people who chose to enter. Sleep well